Hello, my name is Garcia-Rodriguez. I am a sophomore at Tarleton State University, and today I will be talking about Spintronics. So what are Spintronics, or what is Spintronics? Spintronics is a new method of coding and storing memory, where instead of using capacitors and charge, scientists use a different quality of electrons known as spin. Because of the rise in need for more memory and storage, technology has a problem of overheating, which leads to a loss of memory within capacitors. Now, because Spintronics doesn't have to deal with charge, it actually has the capacity to eliminate this problem. Now, what is spin? Spin is a property which all electrons have, just as liquid, solid, gas are all properties of matter, or temperature is a property of people. Spin is a property of electrons. And all electrons have one of two types of spin, either an up spin or a down spin. How do we use spin to code computers? In a traditional computer, the motherboard, which is in charge of your RAM, is comprised of many tiny capacitors. Now, electrons are shot into one of the plates of the capacitors known as an electrode, and it increases charge. When one of these plates has reached a certain charge known as the threshold, it has assigned a value 1. Otherwise, it is assigned a 0. Now, computers speak in their own language comprised of a series of zeros and ones. It uses the zeros and ones in order to create the letter A, create hashtag, star. It creates pixels. Each of these pixels is a color, and each of those colors have a certain set of zeros and ones. It uses a bunch of pixels in order to create images. Sound has their own sets of specific zeros and ones. Because of the need for more storage, devices tend to overheat, and the charge is lost within the capacitors, memory going along with it. If one of the capacitors' charges goes below the threshold, it loses its value and it goes from a 0 to a 1. From a 1 to a 0. Instead of using capacitors and charge, scientists are using spin and devices known as tunneling magnetoresistant sensing structures. Tunnel magnetoresistant structures, or TMS, are comprised of two ferromagnets with an insulator sandwiched in between. Now, one of these magnets is going to be forced to have the same spin, or it's going to be a fixed magnet. The other one is going to be a free magnet. Spin is going to be able to change. Now, whenever the spins are parallel, it's going to read a 1. Whenever it's 0, it's going to be whenever they're opposite. Whenever the two plates are parallel, or the two spins are parallel, the electrons that are going to be shot from the computer are going to be able to actually tunnel through the insulator that is sandwiched in between the two magnets. And whenever they are opposing each other, it's going to actually block the electron's path, and it's going to stop them from going through, and it's going to have this change in charge, which the computer itself is going to be able to read and determine whether it's parallel or opposite, and inevitably do the same thing as it did with capacitors and assign a bunch of zeros and ones, just using these TMSs rather than capacitors, and it's going to be using spin rather than charge. Now, the components of TMS. So I kind of already said it, but it's comprised of two components, which are ferromagnets and insulators. The ferromagnet is just a magnet that is made up of ferromagnetic material. This includes iron and cobalt, and a select other types of metals. I know copper is one of them too, in which there are domains that exist that have aligned dipole moments. By aligning all of these dipoles with a strong net external magnet, you can make a one ferromagnet. So there are tiny little pockets of aligned dipoles. These are going to be our electrons, our spins. They aren't actually dipoles, but you can think of them as dipoles. And whenever you apply a magnet, it's going to align all of these little pockets of parallel dipoles and going to make one giant magnet that has a much stronger magnetic field. Insulators, a lot less complex. This is just a material that stops the flow of electrons between the two magnets. Although, like I said in the last slide, this isn't always going to be the case because of this concept known as tunneling. Now, tunneling, I like to think of it as you're trying to hold water within your hands. Whenever you clasp your hands close enough and tight enough, water is going to kind of collect within your hand, but because water is the way it is, it's going to be able to slip through the cracks and the gaps of your hand, and some of it's going to go through, and this is essentially what tunneling is. Even whenever they have opposing spins, most of the electrons will be stopped by the insulator, but ever so often there will be one or two electrons that go through and tunnel through the insulator and will be picked up by the computer. This isn't entirely bad, it's just the nature of what happens. By sending enough electrons, you can actually change the spin of a free magnetic plate through a process that's known as spin transfer torque by using large enough currents that are polarized electrons from the first fixed magnetic plate. So the computer is going to send out electrons. It's going to send out a current through this first plate. Now, because it's a fixed plate, it's going to make all of the electrons that go through have its same spin. Like I said, some of the electrons will go through and it's going to go through the insulator and hit that next plate. Now, whenever it hits that plate, all of the electrons are going to actually match the same spin as the one that's going through, and it's going to change the spin if it wasn't already parallel. And then if you wanted to change it back again, all you had to do is introduce a strong enough magnetic field and it'll change it back to its original spin that was opposing it. And by doing this, you do the same thing as capacitors, like I said, and you get a series of zeros and ones. Now, the materials that are being used, I've seen many different types of combinations. These are just a handful that I've found. I've found a half metallic ferromagnet comprised of CrO2, which is just chromium 4 oxide. I found a nickel manganese alloy, which is just essentially manganese and nickel just combined together. And then a manganese, pardon my pronunciation of this, but pathyllocyethane. For the insulators, I found a couple, a boron and nitrogen doped graphene, molybdenum disulfide, and carbon nanotubes. One of the things I thought was kind of interesting is the graphene and the nanotubes aren't like elements, they're man-made structures, like little honeycomb structures that the electrons will go through. And that was kind of interesting that they were not just elements like boron or nitrogen. Spintronic versus charge. Spintronics, I kind of said this earlier, but deals with the spin of a electron rather than the charge of it. Because RAM in computers today use capacitors in order to store data, many times the CPU becomes hot to the point where the charge on the electrode begins to decrease and starts to fall below the threshold, and the charge to the value of the capacitor goes from 1 to 0, causing memory loss. I said electrode, that's just the name of the plate. And so with spintronics, because you are using spin of the electron rather than the charge, there is less power that must be used for to change the spin of the magnet rather than constantly having to recharge the capacitors. Whenever one of the capacitors goes below the threshold and it's supposed to be above or at, it doesn't just keep it below the threshold, it has to exert power from its battery and constantly have to bring it back up to threshold. And this is happening within fractions of seconds. This isn't something that's just like every other minute. This is something that's constantly happening that your computers constantly have to keep up with because of the heat. And the capacitors are constantly going below the threshold. And this is one of the advantages of having spintronics versus charge. However, there are a couple of disadvantages. The first one isn't so much a disadvantage as it just doesn't change the problem that we initially had, which is the heat. Because the demand for data will never stop growing, the processors heating is inevitable. It's not gonna change just because we use spintronics. This is just something that is an inevitable truth, especially like if you're trying to make a supercomputer. That thing has a really large processing power and it's going to overheat. But there are different ways of getting around heating. Then this next one it's simple. It's electrons are bound to interact with one another, which affects the spin of electrons. I said earlier, you could think of electrons as dipoles or tiny little magnets. It's easy to think of it like this, but this isn't necessarily the case. Electrons aren't necessarily dipoles, they just have spin. Electrons have a negative charge. And whenever they come in contact or it comes close to another electron, they're going to repel one another. And this is going to affect their spin and it's going to cause spin relaxation. It also affects the magnetic field of it and it eventually decays. How spintronics can be used. So I've been talking about computing throughout this slideshow, but there's actually more to it. Beyond coding, spintronics could have applications in medicine as well. Because the nervous system is comprised of electrical impulses that stem from the brain, it is possible to determine the health of a person based on the magnetic fields that are created from the person's nervous system. Whenever your heart beats, that's your brain sending electrical impulses to your heart to beat. Same thing with your lungs. It's sending pulses to the lungs to expand and contract. Whenever you you have a virus or a bacteria in your body, it sends electrical impulses telling the white blood cells to attack these bacteria and these unhealthy cells. So it's possible that if it could detect the magnetic fields that are created from the body, from the nervous system. It's possible to detect brain tumors from spintronics. I mentioned supercomputing. These have a possibility to be possibly even faster than what we have today. The possibilities for spintronics is really quite remarkable. With that being said, that does conclude my presentation. Thank you for your time and for listening to what I have to say.